So the first question is from Fiona in California. And she's been a beekeeper for about 3 weeks and has 2 colonies. And she set them up from a swarm catch. And she's moved the swarm catch about 100 meters away. And a lot of the bees returned back to that original location where she had caught the swarm. So she's wondering, why did they go back to that area? Well, the reason is because swarms and colonies, when they're in a location, they orient themselves to be in that space, and they learn that location, and their brains are kind of like programmed to go there. And so if you move them, actually, there's a rule in beekeeping that you're not supposed to move them more than 3 feet at a time. And if you move them more than that, and it's under 3 miles, so you got to move them 3 feet or 3 miles. So if you move them, a mile or half a mile or whatever, they will figure out how to go back to the old spot because it's close enough to their old location that they're going to return to there. So usually if it is a swarm, they're easier to move and you can kind of break that rule because they reorient better. But if they had comb already, then they might have been established and learned that location. It's hard to break them of that habit. So yeah, unfortunately, you have to kind of move them like a little bit at a time every day, or you have to move them more than 3 miles away and then bring them back to the location you want them in. Next question is from Damien in Melbourne, and he's new to beekeeping and wants to know whether he should wait until spring to get bees or if he could start beekeeping in the winter. This is why it's really important to get an understanding of the way that the colony works and the seasons, because in spring your colony is building up and their population is getting bigger and they're building new comb, and that's when they're going to be the most successful. And in winter they're kind of hunkered down, they're not really building anymore, they're just surviving. And so if you try to start with a colony in winter, your chances of success are much less. And that's why people say to start in the spring. And that's, the timing is important. So I would definitely wait until spring. And also it would be hard to find bees in the winter. Usually no one's selling colonies at that time. So yeah, definitely wait till spring. He also wants to know whether the placement of a hive, like if you were to put it in a garden compared to an open space, if that matters for pests like bugs and mites. Well, the bugs that bother the honeybees primarily are the wax moths and the hive beetles. And so on the whole, not really, but there are, certain things like the hive beetles, for example, like to pupate in the moist soil. So I found that when you place a hive in an area that is shady and has rich, moist soil right underneath the hive, you're going to have a bigger issue with beetles. Versus if you put it on a concrete pad or on a rooftop, you're going to have less issues with beetles. So there is a little bit something to that. And it's not the most important thing, because a strong colony is not going to have issues with those kind of minor pests anyway. Let's see. Karen from Tennessee has been having ant problems and wants some suggestions on how to deal with keeping ants out of the hive. Yeah, in my area, the ants are a really big issue. They get into the hive and they can actually cause the bees to abscond. So the colony will actually leave the hive and completely abandon it. And it's really terrible if you've just paid, a bunch of money to get a brand new colony and you're all excited. And then in the first week, you completely lose your colony and it's just full of ants. But that's actually when they're the most vulnerable, when they're a new colony. So it's really important to get something in place for ants if that's a problem in your region. So it is definitely by region. Some people don't have as big of an ant issue. I have tried just about everything. We have these invasive Argentine ants here that are just really awful, and they're very difficult to keep out. And so what I do is I like to put my hives on a stand, and I like to have the area underneath the stand completely free of weeds or anything like that. If anything's touching the stand, it becomes a bridge for the ants, because what you're going to do is going to take those legs on your stand and you're going to prevent the ants from getting up the legs. So sometimes people use a sticky substance like a motor oil or something like that. I like to use this stuff called ant cant. It's actually a non-toxic spray, and it's a smooth coating, and it's slippery, and the ants can't cross it. So I sell that in my web shop. If you go to girlnextdoorhoney.com and you click on the shop, if you're in the US, I can ship it to you. Unfortunately, they won't let me ship it internationally because it's flammable, but it works pretty well, and it's non-toxic. If you can also use DE, diatomaceous earth, and cinnamon. Some people find that works. You just kind of have to experiment. But the most important thing is having that good stand where you can kind of fortify the legs. Beth is worried that her hive is queenless, and 10 days ago she saw a young queen running around, and there were places for her to lay eggs, but there were no new eggs. And then 10 days later, there was no queen and no eggs, and so now she's thinking about combining it with another small swarm that she's caught. When you have a new colony and you're not sure if it has a queen or not, especially with swarm catches, this can happen. You're not always sure if you got the queen or if there was a queen ever, or sometimes she's unmated and she goes on her mating flight and never comes back. I usually give them like 2 to 3 weeks. So if it's already been, about 20 days, you could wait another week or so and just double check for eggs. But at this point, you probably are queenless. If I'm not sure, there's this kind of gray area in between that 2 to 3 week period. I usually wait it out. And then if I think they're queenless, yeah, I would combine with just using that newspaper method. She's also noticed that there's a lot of bees underneath her hive. And she's using a screen bottom board, it sounds like. And she wants to know why they're why they're going underneath the hive. I see this a lot, and I think it has to do with temperature control. So sometimes they do it when it's really hot out and they're trying to get bees out of the hive to just reduce the amount of bodies in there. But they can also do it if they're too cold and they're actually using their bodies to block the airflow from going up into the hive, and they're kind of heating from the bottom up. So it depends on where you're located, and Beth didn't say where she was, but I find that if you live in kind of a drier climate, a solid bottom board is better, because they're just able to control their temperature more. If you're using a screen, a lot of people in wet climates use screen bottom boards. If it's working for you, great. But if you're seeing that, it might be a sign that trying a solid bottom would be better. Okay. Derek wants to know when it's time to put his super on the brood box. So this is a really common question, and the answer is really just you have to watch your bees. So if they're building out the bottom box, when it's almost full, then it's time to add the super. So if it's an 8-frame brood box, when they're on the 7th or 8th frame and you see them starting to build, that's a good time to just throw that super on there. Monroe wants to know, how do I recommend getting bees? Should he do a nucleus or should he do a package colony? If you can get a nucleus or package colony, either one of them is good. A lot of people like nucleus colonies because they already have comb. Basically what you're getting is a colony that's already somewhat established, and they're kind of a couple of weeks ahead of what a package colony would be in terms of their progress. Package colonies are good though because they are less likely to have disease. So sometimes you get a nucleus colony, it's already got brood disease going on because there's already brood, but a package won't have that because there's no brood. The other good thing about a package is you can put it into an unconventional hive style. So if you weren't using a flow hive, if you were using a top bar hive or something like that, you could use a package, and that's easier. to install because you don't have any comb to try and deal with. The comb from a nucleus colony wouldn't fit into a top bar, for example. I personally like to use medium size boxes, and nucleus colonies always come in deep size frames. So that's the reason like why I would recommend getting a package is if you want to use all mediums. But I actually would prefer to do a swarm. I think catching swarms in wild colonies is really the best way. So if you can do that, that would be the best. He also wants to know whether it's necessary to get a new queen ever. Yeah, there's definitely times when you'll need a new queen. Usually it's because she's old or she's sick or she's become defensive. Those are the three top reasons. So in those cases, you're replacing a queen that's already there. But there's also sometimes you just don't have a queen. You find that your colony has lost its queen and you need to order one to get one in there quickly. Also, he wants to know how often to inspect the brood box and what to look for. So I always tell my students to look for eggs, a healthy brood pattern, and then take assessment on the space that your bees have and how much honey they have. So I'm always paying attention to, you know, do they have food coming in? Are they making honey or are they using up their stores? Do they need more supers or do they have too much space? And then I always want to look for eggs because that tells me that I have a queen. And then I want to see that healthy brood pattern, that solid patch of capped brood. I don't want it to be spotty because that tells me that the bees are healthy. And I usually go into my hives about once a month, but I'd like to tell beginners to go in like once every 2 weeks if you can, because every time you go in, you're going to be learning something new and you'll be growing in skill. And so your first year, it's really important to take advantage of every opportunity to go in. But you wouldn't want to go in more often than every 2 weeks because that's too much and it'll stress out your bees. We've got Mike from Wisconsin. And he's heard that if a hive gets infected with American foul brood, it needs to be burned. And he wants to know what to do with the plastic flow frames if you get American foul brood. So this, this would be really bad. American foul brood is contagious, really, really contagious. And it can last for a long time in the area. So you have to be really careful with this. And what you want to do is get specific advice from your state jurisdiction. So you really need to go to the local beekeeping, ag department, inspector, apiary inspector, contact them right away, and they will help guide you through it because there's usually different guidelines depending on your location. And you definitely want to report it so they know that it's in the area. But yeah, usually you have to burn everything and the bees have to be put down. And sometimes you can radiate things, but that's not the case here in California. Mark is from Perth and he wants to know whether leaving the super on over winter has any risks in like a warmer climate. So if the colony is, the only risk I would say is like if the colony was too weak and small to really defend that space, leaving on the super could just tax them. Because if you think about it, they're maintaining their space. They have to keep it free of pests. They have to keep it clean. They have to keep it warm. And so if they're not even occupying the full brood box and you leave that super on, it can just be taxing to them to have to maintain both areas. And that can decrease their survival rate. And that would be the only real issue with it. I think in general, you need to leave the bees with some honey through winter if you're not actively feeding them. This changes a lot with your region. So it's really better to talk to a local beekeeper about this because it's very climate specific about how much honey needs to be left over winter, how much you can take, whether or not to leave a super on or not. Wissam has some questions about requeening a aggressive colony, a very defensive queen. This is something that happens a lot in my area because we actually have Africanized bees here. So this is something that comes up a lot with beekeepers. There's lots of different ways to go about it, and the problem is that it's very difficult. So when you have an aggressive colony, they are less likely to accept a new queen, and you have to do lots of special tricks to try and get them to accept her. One of the tricks is to split the colony. So it's kind of a divide and conquer situation. If you split the colony, it's less bees to contend with, and that's going to cut their defensiveness down immediately because they're not as big anymore. And part of what increases defensiveness is the size of the colony. So if you split them, that's a good start. And then you could requeen each half or just one half and then combine them back later. The way that I like to split aggressive colonies is to split them by their age. So the way you do this is the bees that are flying in and out of the colony, those are your foragers. Those are the oldest bees in the colony. They're also the most defensive, and they're the least likely to accept a new queen. So what you could do is you set up a box or hive box in the original location of your hive. If you remember earlier, I talked about how colonies kind of imprint and learn their location, and they will always return to that spot. So what you do is you would move your entire colony away, 10, 15 feet away, whatever, move it away. Or if you don't have that kind of space, you could move it right next to it and turn the entrance the opposite direction. And then you would set up a new box in the original location. That's going to be where all your foragers start to go into because of the location. So they'll all fly into this, we'll call it a catch box, and just put one frame of like honey and one frame of like all cap brood. Make sure you don't give them any brood that's young enough that they could make their own new queen. And then the rest of the frames can be empty. It doesn't have to be that much in there. And the foragers will stay there. And then you end up with one half of the split being older bees, and the other half will just be all the house bees, all the nurse bees in there, and all the brood. And those bees are much more likely to accept a new queen. We have a beekeeper in the local club who always uses the analogy of like wolf cubs. So if you imagine like a pack of wolves and there's a lead wolf, and that wolf is shot and replaced with a totally new wolf that nobody knows, the older wolves are just going to kill that wolf. But if you have like a litter of wolf pups and they lose their mother, and you give them a new wolf in there, or even as sometimes people give them like tigers and stuff, right? Just totally different animals. Because they're so young, they're adaptable, they're more likely to accept her. So that's kind of the concept here. So you're separating the colony by age, and then you requeen the young colony, and you leave the older colony with the older bees. You can just let them die out. Or after the young colony has accepted the new queen and it's been a week or two, you could try to recombine them. So that's one way. And if you want to read more ways, there's actually like a whole article on my blog. It's called How to Requeen Africanized Bees. And it applies to just any defensive bee. They don't have to actually be Africanized. But if you go on there, it's beekeepinglikeagirl.com. Okay. Someone is new to foundationless beekeeping, and they want to know how long it takes for the new colony to make enough comb to support nectar and egg laying. And in their case, it's been over 2 weeks, and they're concerned that there's only a small amount of comb. It's only about the size of a tea saucer. So yeah, that's an important question, and it's one that a lot of new beekeepers miss. Regardless of whether you're doing foundation or not, actually, it doesn't matter if you're foundationless or if you're using foundation. If you notice that your colony is not building comb rapidly in the beginning, that's a sign that they need to be fed. So what it means is that either your colony is too weak to forage, or that there isn't enough forage for them. So what you want to do is start feeding them with sugar syrup. Usually a 1-to-1 ratio of sugar and water is what will encourage them to start building out that wax. And whenever you have a new colony, you could start feeding them right away, just as a rule of thumb, or you can wait. I usually say 2 weeks. So after 2 weeks, if you're only seeing a small amount of comb, like is described here, that's when I would start feeding. And I typically feed new colonies for about a month, and then I kind of ease them off of it. And if I see that they're kind of taking off on their own now, great. If they're not, keep feeding them, I guess. But if it's spring, then there's something wrong. You might have like a weak queen, or there might be a larger issue that you need to deal with. Let's see. Chad is a first-year beekeeper, and his question is, after splitting a hive that has a flow super on, should the super be removed from the brood box until the bees have drawn comb on the empty frames that were added? And if the super needs to be removed, what should be done with it? So if you're splitting, then you'll have 2 brood boxes. If you're doing an even split, they'll each be half empty. What you could do is, if you have 2 brood boxes and 2 flow supers, you could split the flow frames as well. But it depends on whether, I guess I should say, if the flow frames are full, then you can attempt to split them. But if your flow frames are empty, there's no reason to leave them on at that point. So if your flow super is empty and you want to split, I would just take it off and then return it to the hive once they've built and started drawing on those empty combs. But if it's full of honey, you can split it as well. So you can take half the full frames and put it in one half of the split in the upper flow box, and the same thing with the other half, and then put the empty flow frames next to it. What I would do is line it up so that all the full frames in the brood nest and in the flow super are on the same half. So let's say to the right side of the box. So let's say you have 4 full brood frames and 4 full front honey frames, and they're directly above each other. That way they can kind of like cluster together on that half of the space. So the bees aren't necessarily thinking of their space as 2 boxes above and below. It's one complete space to them. So if you think of their cluster in that 3D way, as long as you line up the frames above and below each other, it's still kind of a way to cluster and take care of them. If the super was empty, just like take it off and put it in your garage or wherever you normally store it before and then put it back on. Let's see. Chad is a first-year beekeeper. Oh wait, we already did that one. Carmen is from Florida, and she's using beetle blaster strips in her brood box to control small hive beetles. And now she's ready to add her super, and she wants to know if she should put those beetle strips on the top of her super as well. You can. I honestly have never used those beetle strips because I don't have that big of a beetle problem here, but I know it's an issue in Florida. If you do put it on the top of the super, it just means it'll be easier for you to check. And the bees do drive those beetles to the perimeters of the hive. So they usually will drive them to the top of the frames. So that does seem like a good spot to put it. You might have a little issue with the fit. You can always buy one of those little spacers to put between your flow frames and your inner cover, just to fit that beetle blaster in there. She also noticed that when turning the key to the flow frame, the cells are not flush, and they're like one part of the cell is like slightly raised up, and she wants to know if these should be level. I know what you're talking about here. So the flow cells are kind of like this, and they've got a little gap. I'm like, where's my computer here? They've got a little gap, and the bees will complete the cell. So this little gap, they're going to fill that in, and it will become a sealed cell. So what's important is that the cells are lined up like this, not like this. This is when you're harvesting the honey. This is how they should look when you're putting it in for them to start filling it. Now the top, the surface, is uneven. But don't worry about that, because the bees are going to fill that in with wax and complete it, and it will be even on the face of the comb. And if you're having issues getting it into the correct position, you can always call Flo for support. So just send an email to info@honeyflow.com. Janine is from Western Australia, and they have fairly mild winters, average about 9 degrees Celsius. I don't know what that means. They are headed into autumn, and she wants to know whether to feed with sugar water or not, and if so, whether open feeders are recommended. So feeding is always a question. You know, a lot of beekeepers will tell you to just blanket feed. I'm not a fan of that. I always recommend that you watch your bees, you check their honey stores. If they have honey stored, there shouldn't really be a reason to feed them, especially if you're in a mild climate. If there isn't a lot of stores, then that would be a reason to start feeding them. So watch the bees coming in. Are they bringing in pollen on their legs? Are their flowers still blooming? Are they still making honey? And just try to pay attention to that. If you do decide to feed them, I would not recommend doing an open feeding. That's going to draw a lot of bees, all the bees in the area from different colonies. And what's going to happen is those bees are what we call robber bees, and they have a habit of kind of breaking into other colonies and trying to steal from them. So what you've done is just drawn a bunch of robber bees from all over to your apiary, and they might decide to then attack your colony. So definitely don't free feed next to your colony. It's generally not a good idea to do it at all. If you're going to feed them, you want to set it up so that it's actually inside your colony. There's different kinds of feeders that fit inside your actual boxes, and that way it's protected and the bees can access it without having to leave their hive. Okay, Christian wants to know whether an apethor beetle trap can be placed on top of the classic flow hive, and he hasn't had much success with the vegetable oil beetle traps, and he's worried about his beetle numbers. Yeah, you can place the core flute in the lower position, and it can be put on the top. If you're in the southern hemisphere, the beetle numbers should be going down as the weather gets cooler. Dirk from the UK is new to beekeeping, and there's a shortage of nukes available in his area, and he wants to know whether the Hoffman UK national nukes could be used to put bees in the flow hive, which has Langstroth dimensions, and how you would do this. So you could do this. It would be tricky for a total beginner, I think. But basically, you would be shaking the bees off of the frames of your national nuke, and you would have to cut the comb out of those frames and place them in your flow frame, your flow brood frames, your Langstroth frames, and then use rubber bands to hold them in place. It's a little bit traumatic. It's a little bit like stressful, but if you do it early enough in spring, your bees should be able to recover, and you might want to feed them after you do that, just because it's this kind of stressful thing, and they're going to have to reattach all their combs. You have to be really careful doing this, though, especially if the comb is very new. It'll be really difficult to handle without destroying. You have to do it quickly so the brood doesn't get chilled, and you have to be careful of your queen. So it can be a challenge. I would definitely, if you're going to do that, try to find some experienced beekeeper to help you. Garode from Ireland, I feel like I totally messed that up, even though they wrote the pronunciation for me. Expects to get his first bees shortly, and he wants to know if it's better off using foundation if his bees come in a package rather than a nuke, or would foundationless frames still work with packaged bees? And so whether or not this makes a difference for like how quickly they can establish. I prefer foundationless 100%, especially in the brood nest. That's where you're going to see the best benefit. So if you let your bees build natural comb in the brood nest, their cell sizes will be better adjusted to their actual size of the bees. It also allows them to make drone cells, which is important to the health of the colony. When you use foundation, all the cell sizes are the same, and it actually suppresses them from making drones as they naturally would. And it can increase the size of the worker bees to an unnatural level, which can possibly lead to health issues later on. So if you are going to, go into the brood nest, if you're setting up your brood nest, I do prefer foundationless. If you did want to use foundation, I really don't think that it makes that big of a difference in terms of how quickly they establish. So, and I get the concept of, oh, it's a package, they need more help. I would just feed them if you're worried about it. I don't think doing the foundation really helps them build more quickly. And I often see, at least in my area, that it hinders their progress. Sometimes the foundation actually slows them down because they refuse to build on it, or they won't draw it out well. They'll draw it out in chunks or not fully. But when you let them have foundationless frames, they just go for it, and they know exactly what they're doing. They start building their comb. So I would recommend going foundationless. There's several articles on my blog, beekeepinglikeagirl.com, that talk about different foundationless issues. As well as beekeeper.org, I did a video on foundationless beekeeping. Lindsay from, I don't know the abbreviation, Southeast QLD, is expecting higher than average temperatures this winter. And being new to beekeeping, they thought it was too late to split in March, and they lost half of their hive to swarming. And the recent temperatures have been 9 to 30 degrees. That sounds like a big jump. Would it be likely for the bees to swarm in higher temperatures? I guess it depends on your time of year. I'm guessing you're in Australia, and I think it's fall there now. So it's usually unlikely that they would swarm that time of year, but it really depends on your climate. Like here in Southern California, we can get swarms in the fall. So if warmer temperatures do sometimes encourage the bees to swarming, or I guess just make it possible for the bees to swarm. When it's cool, they're not thinking about it as much. So I would just monitor your colony, as you normally would, and watch out for those queen cups, because that's going to be the indicator that they're thinking about swarming. All right. Got a question from Florida. He started his flow hive a few months ago, and they added their super about 2 weeks ago. And he wants to know how you can tell whether the bees are bearding or just because, or if they're preparing to swarm. It's been rainy and windy, and the bees are hanging out on the entrance a lot. Bearding is normally an indication of warm weather or crowding. If you're in Florida, it's always warm for the most part, right? So bearding would not be unusual, especially this time of year. Even if it is raining, I think it's usually like a warm rain. I would definitely go into your colony and check out how much space they have. Sometimes, even though you've added a new super, they don't move up into it. And so it doesn't actually reduce the crowding. If you're seeing that, what you can actually do is brush the face of your flow frames with some melted beeswax, and that will help encourage them to go up, and it might relieve some of the crowding below. He has also seen a lot of dead bees around the entrance, and he wants to know whether this is a worry. So if it's been raining, that's actually very normal. So when it's raining, the bees are not able to behave as they normally would. So for example, The undertaker bees are normally carrying dead bees out of your colony all the time. And if the porch of your hive is all wet, and the undertakers, and it's raining, the undertakers cannot get out of the hive and they can't drag the bees. So sometimes they just push them out the front door, and they're not clearing them as well as they normally would. So if it's been raining and things are wet, it's totally normal to see like dead bees just kind of everywhere. What I usually recommend is that you get an idea, go observe your bees every day and watch the entrance and get an idea of what's normal, because when you need to worry is when you see a sudden change that's unexplained. So if it's raining, a sudden change makes sense, right? They're just stuck and they're wet and they can't move them. But if it's dry and, all of a sudden you see a big increase in the dead bees, that can be an indication that something's wrong. So just try and observe them and get a sense of what's normal. And don't worry unless you see a big change all at once. So also, he's still not seeing that much activity in the flow frames after 2 weeks. And he wants to know how long does it take for them to fill that super with honey. Like I said, there's some tricks that you may need to do to try and draw them up into the super. So painting beeswax on the face is a good idea. But 2 weeks is not very long. This question is just so dependent on your region and the nectar flow, and it's different every year. So like 1 year here in San Diego, I might have a colony that's very strong and very healthy, and we're in the thick of a really good nectar flow. I might have a colony fill up that flow super halfway. And then other years they never fill it at all. So it depends on how much rainfall you've gotten. Has to be the right balance. There has to be a good nectar flow happening. The temperatures have to be right. If there's too much rain, they can't get out to forage, so it'll take them longer to fill it. So there's all these factors happening that will change the answer to that question. Finally, he wants to know about feeding, and he was feeding protein patties, but he stopped because they're attracting beetles, and he wants to know whether supplemental feeding with sugar water or patties or both, like what's recommended, and does he need a door feeder? This is the kind of feeder that you just stick in the entrance of your hive, or a box feeder, which is inside of the boxes. Which one's better for sugar water? So like I said earlier, I only feed if I'm seeing my bees kind of stall, like they're not progressing, they're not building comb. Generally, you don't want to feed them once you put your super on, because then you'll just get sugar water in your honey super, and you don't want that. In terms of what kind of feeder to use, you could use either of those feeders. I usually say the one inside, the box feeder inside of the hive, is better because it's more protected. Sometimes the entrance feeders will draw robber bees, and that can create an issue. The advantage of the one at the entrance is that you can see when the levels have gone down. So that's one of the mistakes beekeepers make when they start feeding sugar water. They just kind of, they don't check it often enough, and they don't realize how quickly a colony that needs to be fed can actually use up all that sugar water. So once you start feeding, check on it like every 3 days, because you don't want to feed them and then let it sit for 3 weeks just empty. Then you've ruined the point of feeding them. Okay. Wayne is from the south coast of New South Wales, and he introduced bees to his flow hive in January. And at the same time, he put on his flow super, and this might have been too early. And he wants to know whether this will be harmful to the bees and impact his honey harvest in the future, whether he should remove that super. So usually you would not put on the super right away at the same time as installing your colony. You want to let your bees, you want to install them into just the brood box and then let them build up and start to fill that brood box before adding the super on. And that's because it will just be a stressor to have to maintain all that space. I kind of talked about that earlier, how they have to monitor all the space that's in there. And so when they're new, you only want to give them as much as they need. It's also harder for them to maintain that temperature in there. So if they have not built the brood box out all the way and they're not up in the flow super, I would take it off and put it back on as you see them getting close to filling that bottom brood box. Once again, should we feed them? I feel like we already talked about this. You know, just watch your bees, see if they're not progressing that quickly. It's okay to try feeding them. It's not going to really hurt them, you know. So if they've been sitting in that brood box and they haven't really been growing, go ahead and try feeding them sugar water, see if it makes a difference. Linton from Victoria has found that bees are slow to migrate to his flow hive. And since only 6 frames were well populated, he decided to remove the super for the colder months. And then in spring, he intends to add the super again. However, his flow frames are infested with ants, and he wants to know how he can keep the ants out when he adds the super again. So our flow team here has said that there's a tip for reassembly. You can use the elastic bands to hold the blades together while you put the wires on. So if you do have to take it apart to kind of get the ants out, I guess you could do that. Honestly, like what I would do is just throw it in the freezer. Just kill all the ants. And then you could put it back on your hive, you know, put it in the freezer right before you put it back on the hive. And that way, when you put it on, everything in there is dead and your bees will just clean it out for you. You know, they can clean way better than you can. So I usually, you know, you don't need to worry about like cleaning your flow frames. The bees are going to do that. But if there are critters in there, you know, wax moths or whatnot, throwing it in the freezer will take care of it. So just put it in the freezer for like 24, 48 hours usually. Robin wants to know whether you can switch from plastic foundation to foundationless frames and whether spring would be the best time to do this. Yes, spring is the best time to do this. You can do it. It's time consuming and you need to do it gradually. So what you can do is, what I do is the frames that are plastic that I want to get rid of, and this applies really to anything, any frames that you want to get rid of. Like let's say you have a frame that the wood broke, or you have a frame with some wonky cross comb on it. Move it up into the super area and shake all the bees off. Make sure the queen's not on there, especially if you have a queen excluder on. But then move it up and wait for the bees to either empty it of brood or turn it into honey. And then you can just harvest it out. And so you don't want to do this all at once, obviously. So you have to do this slowly, like 1 or 2 frames at a time in the spring when they are ready to build. So as you see them drawing out new comb, this is a good time to try and do this. So you're slowly moving the frames you don't want up to be turned into honey, and you're replacing them with new empty frames to be foundationless. Of course, with comb guides. Don't forget those. Unless you're putting it in between 2 already straight drawn frames, and then you don't need a comb guide, I guess. But yeah, so it's just kind of a gradual thing, but it can be done. Allison from Canada is in a place where springtime temperatures can fluctuate, and she can have totally fine days to like a -20 cold snap. And how can she support her bees so that they survive these cold snaps? This is really tough, and a lot of beekeepers do lose colonies in the spring when they have these cold snaps that just come on. Because what happens is your colony is kind of broken its cluster, its winter cluster, and it's behaving as if it's spring. And then when you get these sudden cold snaps, they're not prepared and it can wipe them out. So if you see that coming in the forecast, what you can actually do is you can make sure you've got your colony well insulated. And actually it might be good just to leave insulation on longer than you normally would. There's something called like what's it called? There's a box that you put on top. It's like an extra fat roof. and you can put even more insulation material in there. A quilt box, I think it's called. That might be a good thing to put on, but there's not a whole lot we can do about Mother Nature just being erratic with us. So that's about the only thing I can think of. I don't really have this problem being in San Diego, but I'm aware that it happens and it sounds very stressful. So hopefully that would help, putting some kind of insulation around them. Clem says that his bees are attracted to honey during the harvest in the fall, and he currently puts his containers and flow tubes in a plastic bag and then seals it with a rubber band while harvesting. And he's noticed that in the demos, there are no bees hanging around, and he wants to know what the secret is. So it sounds like when he's harvesting from his flow, the bees are all trying to rob the honey. And I've had it happen both ways. It just depends on the colony, really. Some colonies like are just clueless, or they're too busy. Maybe it's like there's a nectar flow going on or something, and they're just too busy to care that you're robbing them of their honey. And they don't really seem to notice that you're harvesting off the back side. Other times they come around and they definitely try to get in the bucket, and they get a little bit crazy. So I like to do, I actually go to like a beer brewer store and I buy the beer brewer like food grade tubing, and I attach that to my little flow tubes and I run it directly into a bucket, and it goes right into a hole in the lid. So everything's well sealed and I don't have to worry about bees falling in or doing anything like that. So I know there's like videos of people just like letting the honey free fall in a stream. But in my experience, I also have had robbers come and just kind of get in the honey. So I don't usually do that. Michelle is new to beekeeping and learning from a few early mistakes. And she realized that she needs to move her hive, and she also needs to deal with some crazy cross comb, and she also might need to requeen. So wow, that's a lot of stuff. So she needs some advice on how to move the hive a few feet from its current location. And she wants to know if requeening needs to be done in a particular season. So what I would say is that requeening can usually only be done when queens are available. So that's usually spring and summer. You can't usually buy queens in the fall or the winter. So typically you need to take that into consideration. I would not do these two things at once, maybe move the colony first, let them get settled. If you're only moving them a few feet, even if you're turning the entrance a different way, it should be okay. So what I would do is move them a few feet, but keep the entrance facing the way that it was facing. And then once they've learned that, then turn them so the entrance is facing the other way. Be aware that when you move them, that's something that can make them more defensive. And then I don't know if that's the reason why you want to requeen. It doesn't say why you want to requeen, but I think there's going to be a video coming out soon about requeening on beekeeper.org. So watch for that. And, like I said, generally you only requeen if your colony is sick, the queen is not producing well, or if they've become defensive. So the crazy comb actually makes it harder to requeen, which is kind of a bummer, because you're going to need to be able to go in and look at every piece of comb. And if it's all cross-combed, then you can't see what you're doing and you can't look for those queen cells, and it'll be harder to find the queen. So usually when I've got a situation like that, I will fix the crazy comb and try to find the queen and kill her like all at the same time. But if you don't find her, then just come back later, because it is a lot to do all at once. And this sounds like a very tall order. I would again try to find someone local to help you, because this will be challenging for a new beekeeper. Let's see. Margot has a hive with a brood box and a flow hive super, and a standard super above the flow hive super. And she would like to know when to reduce the hive from 3 boxes to 2, and whether this is determined by the bees or the temperature. So I'm going to assume that those are full. If they're empty, take off the extra box now. There's no reason to have that much space unless they're actively starting to build in it. So if you're, I don't know what the purpose of putting a standard super above the flow super was, but I guess if you want to harvest, you would harvest the flow super, take that off, and then move your other super down, possibly for winter. I'm a little confused about why this setup is happening, but just keep in mind that it's a continuous cluster. So you never would want to like harvest the flow super in the middle and then leave that empty while it's full in your upper super and full in your bottom brood box. So if you do that, move the brood box, move the upper super down so that it's at least together. And the bees can cluster on it. She also wants to know whether it really matters that brood and pollen get into the flow frames, and whether or not she should remove the excluder for winter, or if it's better. If you leave your flow super on for winter, I would leave the queen excluder on. I've taken the excluder off my flow hive before, and the queen went up there and laid a bunch of drones. So that's what can happen. And then you have all these cocoons in your flow frames, and it makes it a little harder to harvest the honey because it's like crunchy and it doesn't want to work as well. And then obviously while the drones are in there, you wouldn't want to harvest because then you're killing all these drones. So yeah, it does matter. You would leave your excluder in place. Jason wants to know how to treat for mites naturally, and he wants to keep his hive organic. So this is a tough thing because the most important thing to realize about mite treatment is that it matters where you get your bees from. So if you get your bees from a beekeeper who treats for mites aggressively, those bees are going to be reliant on mite treatments to survive. Genetically, they're not able to survive without mite treatments. So if you want to try to do some lesser mite treatments or go more natural, you want to try and find a beekeeper who's using those same techniques and get bees from that person, and somebody who's having success. So it really matters where you source your bees from in this case. And then I would learn as much as you can about how bees live naturally, because that's going to help inform you about strategies that are more natural for helping with mites. So one strategy is mites live on the brood, right? They live on the larva, and they reproduce when the larva is capped. And so one thing that helps colonies in nature survive against mites is that they have less brood. They have smaller brood nests. So you can never have a huge population of mites because their brood nests are smaller. So that's why I like using a queen excluder to keep my brood nests relatively small, because it keeps the mite population from exploding too high. When you let them have multiple brood boxes, sometimes the mite population can get really out of control. The other thing is that the bees are swarming every spring, at least once. And when they swarm, their queen leaves the hive and there will be a period of broodlessness. So they have a brood break, and that period will help reduce the number of mites in the colony because there's no brood to live on, so the mite population will go down. So if you're controlling your swarming, then you're never allowing them to have that brood break, and the mite populations can just build and build and build. So one thing I like to do is create brood breaks either by splitting the colony or by caging the queen for like 2 weeks, so she can't lay. You cage her and you leave her in the hive, and then you release her after 2 weeks. So that just creates a forced brood break to kind of make up for if you've been controlling their swarming. You could also just let them swarm, but that's a personal beekeeper choice, depends on a lot of different things. So that's just some of the techniques. A lot of people who do that style of mite control are using multiple techniques, and they've developed something that works for them, and it's going to depend on, it's going to be unique to you. So you'll have to kind of experiment and monitor closely. Let's see. I feel like we're almost out of time here. See if there's another quick question we can do. Bobby wants to know, after you buy a package of bees, how long should you leave the entrance reducer in? I would say like 2 to 3 weeks, or just watch your colony. And if you start to see them getting backed up at the entrance, there's a lot of traffic, you can pull it out. You know, I usually leave my entrance reducers on all year because I do a lot of bee rescues and removals of wild colonies, and I see that they almost all have really small entrances. So I think in nature they prefer to have small entrances, and I don't worry that much about whether or not the entrance reducer is on or not. I would rather, if I saw them getting backed up at the entrance, instead of removing that, I often will add an upper entrance to give them direct access to the honey super area. So yeah, so I think we're gonna wrap this up because I can only talk for so long. Thanks everyone for your time and for coming to today's session. And we've had so many questions coming in. I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question. I tried to get a good variety here, and hopefully you guys found this helpful. And if you want to keep learning from me, there's going to be videos on beekeeper.org, or you can also head to my blog, beekeepinglikeagirl.com, where there's a lot of articles written by me, and on my IG, so on my Instagram. My Instagram handle is just @girlnextdoorhoney. A lot of people get little tips from me on there. And you can also check out my books. I have them right here. This is my little book of bees if you want to learn about all different kinds of bees. And this is the one that's probably most helpful to new beekeepers because it's about finding the queen.